Hello everyone, Professor Krizluk here. So I wanted to make a video talking about voting and elections in American government. So when we think of democracy, when we think about democracy in the United States, voting and elections usually the first things that come to mind, the hallmark of a democracy. How most people engage with a democracy is through voting, is through elections. Maybe around election time is when people start to pay attention to politics. A lot of Americans, when it's not election time, they're not following politics on a day-to-day basis. So elections, voting is really the entry level, the ground floor of democracy. So when we think of elections are how political power changes hands, how leaders are chosen, and how citizens are supposed to hold governments accountable. If you don't like your elected official, you vote them out. If you don't like the direction of the country, you vote them out. But elections, while elections are central to American democracy, they don't always work as smoothly or even as fairly as the idealized version we often imagine elections working. So, at its most basic level, though, voting is a form of political participation. It's how individuals express preferences among candidates, parties, and oftentimes, or at least sometimes, between competing policies. Elections are the process that turns those individual preferences into collective outcomes. But who participates in elections and how those elections are structured has a major impact on political outcomes. One of the most important facts about American elections is that not everyone votes. Voter turnout in the United States is relatively low compared to other democracies, especially in off-year elections. So midterm elections, local elections, we oftentimes hear this discussion around the presidential elections, which are relatively well attended, but compared to European countries, other democracies, maybe not even that high. But when we look at off-year elections, local elections, the turnout can be quite low. Although, even in presidential elections, millions of eligible voters choose not to participate. In non-presidential years, turnout drops pretty low. So, this then raises a pretty obvious question. Why don't more people vote? Part of the answer is institutional. In the United States, voters are generally responsible for registering themselves. Elections themselves are often held on work days for many people, and voting rolls vary pretty widely from state to state. These factors make participation more complicated than maybe it needs to be. There are also political and social reasons why people don't vote. Some people feel disconnected from political parties, disconnected from those candidates. Others believe their vote won't make a difference, especially in states that consistently lean towards one party. Some face real barriers related to time, maybe time off work, time away from family, transportation, getting to polls if you have to vote in person, disability concerns, or access to information. Also, some people might feel that the candidates don't represent them, their views, their socioeconomic background, so they sit out elections. They just say, no, none of these candidates represent my views, so they sit out. So, importantly, turnout is not evenly distributed across the population. Older citizens, wealthier individuals, and people with higher levels of education are more likely to vote. Younger voters, lower income citizens, and marginalized groups tend to vote at lower rates. This matters because election officials are more responsive to the people who actually participate in democracy. In that sense, voting isn't just a civic act, it's a way of signaling political importance. Voting rolls themselves are a major source of political conflict. States control most aspects of election administration. Remember, federalism. Which means voting procedures can look very different depending on where you live. Debates over voter ID laws, early voting, mail in ballots, and voter registration are really debates around access versus security. Supporters of stricter rules argue they protect election integrity. Critics argue they make voting harder for certain groups or certain communities. Recent elections have brought these debates to the forefront. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many states expanded mail-in and early voting, leading to record turnout in 2020. At the same time, disputes over election legitimacy and post-election challenges intensified arguments over trust, fraud, and democratic norms. These conflicts show that elections are not just administrative processes, they are deeply political events. Beyond who votes, how elections are structured also matters. Most American elections use a winner-take-all system, where the candidate with the most vote wins, even if it's not a majority of the voters. This system strongly encourages a two-party system and makes it difficult for third parties to compete successfully. Voting for a third-party candidate often feels risky because it may split the vote and help elect a less preferred major political party. So what does that look like? And I'm sure you've all heard this. Well, don't vote for that third party because you'll help the other side win. If you're more associated with this side, you're told to vote for that side so the other side doesn't win. You may have heard about like throwing away votes or wasted votes. That's what we're talking about here. A winner-take-all system really encourages this two-party system. Excuse me. The presidential election system adds another layer of complexity through the Electoral College. Instead of electing the president through a national popular vote, voters technically choose electors who then vote for president. Because electoral votes are allocated by state, it is possible for a candidate to win the presidency without winning the most votes nationwide. This has happened multiple times in U.S. history and remains one of the most controversial features of American democracy. And every 4 years, when there's a presidential election, this discussion will come to the forefront. Is the Electoral College a fair system? Does the Electoral College properly elect the president? So in 2028, when we are living through another election, you will undoubtedly hear discussions about this. They are rooted in the Electoral College, and is that the most fair way to choose a president? Elections themselves are also shaped heavily by campaigns, money in politics, and media. Modern campaigns are long, they're quite expensive, and highly professionalized. Candidates rely on fundraising, advertising, polling, and data analysis to target voters. Money plays a major role, especially in competitive races, And well-funded candidates often have significant advantages in visibility and their ability to buy advertisements and in messaging, to being their ability to get the message out. Social media has transformed campaigns as well. Candidates can now communicate directly with voters without relying on traditional media outlets like we've talked about in other videos. This can increase engagement and mobilization, but it can also amplify misinformation, disinformation, emotional appeals, and polarization. Campaigns today are as much about shaping narratives as they are about policy debates. Another important way to think about elections is that they are often retrospective rather than prospective, which might seem kind of strange. So let's repeat that. Another important way to think about elections today is that they are oftentimes retrospective rather than prospective. Many voters base their decisions less on campaign promises and more on evaluations of past performances, economic conditions, approval of current leaders, and major events often matter more than detailed policy platforms that the candidates are putting out. In this sense, elections function as a kind of public judgment of how things are going or how they have been in the recent past. So, how well do elections work in practice? The answer is mixed. Elections do provide a mechanism for accountability. Leaders can be removed from offices in democracies. Political change is possible without violence. But elections also reflect inequalities in participation, influence, and access. They do not automatically produce outcomes that reflect the preferences of the entire population. Ultimately, voting in elections are a foundation of American democracy, but they are not the whole story. Understanding who participates, how elections are structured, and how campaigns operate helps explain why political outcomes often look the way they do. Elections are powerful, but they are shaped by roles, institutions, and political choices. And those choices matter just as much as the act of voting itself. Thank you.